This game was played just a couple days ago at the Altibox Norway chess tournament. Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces and his compatriot Aryan Tari has the black pieces. Tari is a young grandmaster from Norway with a FIDE rating of 2634. So Carlsen opens with e4 and they play a Ruy Lopez, and Tari plays a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, and Tari goes for a closed variation here with bishop to e7. Now if you look at the database, the overwhelming move in this position is rook to e1. That's the main line of the closed variations. But Carlsen has played d3 in this position a lot lately. He does like this move d3. And at that point, since Carlsen is protecting his e4 pawn, he's threatening to win the e5 pawn by removing the defender and capturing with his knight. So Tari deals with that by playing b5 and then bishop to b3. Now Tari would like to play knight to a5 to harass the bishop and free his c-pawn, but he can't do it here because his e-pawn would hang, so he protects it first with d6. Carlsen plays a4 to gain an escape square for his bishop if it gets harassed, but he's also threatening to win a pawn here on b5. Black would not be able to recapture because his rook on a8 would hang. So Tari plays bishop d7, protecting his rook in the corner, and Carlsen plays c3, perhaps preparing the move d4 to expand in the center, also giving the bishop another option here for where to go. Tari plays knight a5, threatening the bishop, and if you look in the database here, the preferred move is bishop c2. And that does put the bishop in a position where it's going to be guarding the d-pawn, guarding the e-pawn rather, if the d-pawn moves forward. But it may be passive on the c2 square. Carlsen plays it back to a2, keeping it on this strong open diagonal pointed at f7. This does allow Tari to take the pawn on a4 though. He has it protected by his bishop. He doesn't take the pawn, he plays c5. Okay, what would happen if he takes the pawn? What would Carlsen have planned? Well, let's take a look at a game from 2017, Carlsen versus Ding Liren in the same position, and see what Carlsen did after Ding plays b takes a4. So Carlsen played knight d2, castles, bishop b1, you'll see the point of that in a second, bishop b5, putting pressure on d3, bishop c2. So that was Carlsen's plan in the position, was to redeploy his bishop to c2 to attack that a pawn and recover it. He's not threatening to win it just yet because his d pawn would fall. Ding Liren plays knight b7, and then c4 to protect the d3 pawn before taking on a4. Bishop d7 and then bishop takes a4. This line is preferred by the engine over the line that Tari played, where Tari did not capture on a4. Notice here that Carlsen has a hole in his position on d4 corresponding to Ding Liren's hole on d5, which is not actually a hole yet until that c-pawn would move forward to c5. So Carlsen has a little positional concession here when he pushes his pawn to c4. It's no longer protecting the d4 square. But that did help him regain the a-pawn, and now Black's a-pawn is isolated and vulnerable. So that's another way the game could have went. But back to the Tari game. Okay. So Tari plays c5 in this position. He wants to get that move in a hurry because Carlsen might play b4 and drive that knight back, and the knight would want to go to c6, but he doesn't want to block his c-pawn. So Tari plays c5 right away, and then Carlsen plays bishop to g5. Now you're going to notice that throughout the whole game the d5 is a focal point. Carlsen wants to occupy d5 with a knight, and he wants to eliminate all of the defenders of the d5 square. He would love to trade off black's knights so they can't guard d5 and black's light squared bishop. And if he can get a knight there with these three pieces gone off the board, it's going to be a monster. Let's see what happens. Tari castles, and then Carlsen plays knight b d2. Rook b8. I guess maybe he is threatening to take the a pawn and pressure the b pawn here, but as soon as he moves his rook over, Carlsen takes the opportunity to exchange pawns and win control of the a file, now that the rook has left the a file. Rook e1. b4, perhaps justifying the rook's existence on the b8 square, supporting that pawn push. Knight to c4. Carlsen would love to trade off that knight. As I said earlier, he wants to get rid of any defenders of the d5 square. Knight takes c4, bishop takes c4, pawns trade, and the pawn structure here in the center favors white. This pawn on c3 is doing a good job defending this potential hole on d4. It also supports a possible pawn push to d4, but Carlsen's goal is really to occupy that hole on d5. Queen to c7, queen to c2, connecting the rooks. Bishop to b5. I guess black decided that bishop on c4 was just too strong of a piece pointed at f7 and controlling the d5 square, so he willingly offers a trade of one of the potential defenders of that d5 square. Carlsen is happy to trade bishops, and then he trades off his dark squared bishop for black's remaining minor piece that could possibly influence d5. Bishop takes f6. Now this knight has to head for the d5 square, and it takes 4 steps to get there, and Carlsen starts with knight to d2, queen to c6, queen to a4, rook fb8, doubling rooks, knight to c4. Now, by the way, the knight is also very powerfully posted on c4. Carlsen is not necessarily in a hurry to get it over to d5. From c4, Carlsen's putting pressure on the d6 pawn. And the d6 pawn can't move forward, of course. That square is under control, and the e5 pawn would drop. Bishop to e7. Conceding Carlsen's point, he has to nurse the d6 square. He doesn't want his queen to do it. He wants to use his bishop. g3, gaining luft for his king. I like to do that same move when my opponent has a dark squared bishop. I'd rather put my pawn here and blunt any incursion by the dark squared bishop rather than getting luft with h3 and leaving a dark square diagonal open to that square. So g3, queen c8, queen d1. Carlsen shifting his king back over to the king side for attacking purposes. g6, Carlsen improves his king, bishop f8, queen f3. The queen is accidentally posted on f3, influencing both f6 and f7 in the position. Rook to b3, hitting the c3 pawn. Carlsen guards it. Queen to e6, protecting both of these squares. Rook to a7, taking control of the 7th rank. But Tari can't have the rook there pointed at that vulnerable f7 square, so he opposes it. And Carlsen trades rooks, which removes that attacker on his c-pawn, so he can slide his rook over to a1 now. Tari expands with h5, rook to a8, pinning the bishop on f8. Excellent file, or excellent rank for the rook. If you can't have the 7th, maybe the 8th is good. Okay, king to g7, getting out of the pin. And now Carlsen realizes his knight isn't posted best on c4. He would like it to be on d5 at this point to control that vulnerable f6 square that his queen is pointed at. So he starts to transfer it, knight to e3, rook to c7. Perhaps rook to c7 is intending to challenge the white rook here on c8, guarded by the queen. So knight to d5 gets to that excellent hole in the position that he's been eyeing the whole game. Rook to c8 to challenge the a8 rook, rook to a7 transferring to the 7th rank. Rook to b8 going to an open file. And now Carlsen needs to find a way to break through in this position. All of his pieces, his queen, his knight, and his rook are ideally placed. He cannot really improve them, and there's nothing to do in the center. So he decides to push his kingside pawns and perhaps go for opening an h-file or even getting a pawn all the way to g5 to further control f6. And he begins with h3, rook to d8. Black doesn't seem to have anything productive to do. He kind of shuffles his pieces around. g4. Okay, now he's threatening to push it to g5. Black trades pawns, and now white does have an open h file to work with anytime he wants it. Rook to d7, rook to a8. Now black pushes f6 to control g5. He sees Carlsen's threat of pushing his own pawn to g5. He pushes to g5 anyway. The pawn cannot be taken because there is a loose bishop here on f8. So black would lose. But it can push forward, and he does. He fixes the pawn, blocks out the queen for the moment, but the queen can always turn her attention to the h-file, which Carlsen does. Tari plays rook f7, trying to get into a defensive position here, guarding his bishop. Rook to e8. This is how Carlsen finishes him off with beautiful tactics, attacking the queen. The queen has nothing better than to take the rook. The only safe square it could move to is d7, and black would suffer a similar fate as he does in the game, starting with queen to h6 check. Blocking with the bishop, blocking the attack with the bishop is no good because there's a mate here on h8 if the rook has access to that square. So there's nothing black can really do. He's lost in this position, so let's see how it finishes after queen takes rook. Beautiful rook sacrifice. So Carlsen has just decoyed the queen away from protecting the g6 pawn. And he comes into h6 with check, king is forced back, and then he takes that g6 pawn with check. Now there are 3 legal moves in the position, all 3 lose. Tari chose king to h8, which loses, as we'll see in a second. But let's look at the other blocking moves. Rook to g7 blocks but drops the queen, and still have a knight over here, so there's no way black can survive that. Bishop can block here, but then there is knight to f6 check, forking the king and the queen, and if the rook takes, then there is queen takes queen. So there's nothing better to do in this position. After queen takes g6 check, the king goes into the corner, and then Carlsen plays knight to f6, threatening the queen and also threatening a mate on g8, and there's no defense to both. You can take the knight, but you lose your queen. Okay? And then maybe you suffer like this, and you just die in a couple moves. Okay, so beautiful finish. Great move, rook to e8 in this position. So Carlsen was very sharp with his tactics here. Thanks for watching the video.